Welcome now to the 5th lecture on background history of the New Testament. Now we turn our attention to archaeology. In a bit we will be looking at a number of archaeological finds, but for now I want you to understand what archaeologists do. Since I'm a practicing archaeologist, it's important to know what we do and what we can learn from archaeology and what we can't learn from archaeology. There are certainly many limitations. We will talk about what is a tell, the making of a tell, how you interpret what you find, the stratification of a tell, typology, pottery, coins, how you date things, both relatively and then absolutely. And finally, we will talk about the relationship between archaeology and written sources. So first then, the making of a tell. A tell is, if you see one, it's simply a mound sticking up out of the ground, and it's an artificial mound. It consists of layers of debris that have been deposited by layers of civilization. People have lived there, they've left stuff behind, the place has gotten knocked down, they rebuilt, and so you get layers and they build up and make this artificial flat-topped hill. That's what we call in Israel a tell. So because of how tells are shaped, and by the way, some tells may only have one layer, some of them may have many layers, many of them have 3, 4, 5 layers. A few have many. Places like Hatzor and Megiddo have more than 20 different layers. Tells are, each layer we call a stratum. So the stratum is the singular, strata is the plural, and the analysis of these strata is called stratification. And of course, the old stuff is lower, and the new stuff is higher. That much we can tell. Very often we can, if you cut a section, sort of a cross-section of a tell, as you see in this particular slide, for example, which is from Heinrich Schliemann's excavation at Troy, you can see the various layers because they're different colors, they're different consistency, and so on. Also, what they contain is different, and we can analyze what each stratum contains. So tells are made up of strata. We want to analyze the strata in relationship to each other, and we want to analyze what we find within each stratum. And of course, the stratification of a tell tells us where's the newer stuff and where's the older stuff in relation to each other. But that's all we can tell is in relation to each other. We can't tell any absolute dates without doing further interpretation. How does an archaeologist approach a tell when we go to excavate? There are two basic philosophies. One would be the peel the onion method. You would try to excavate one stratum, and then the next, and then the next, and then the next. The problem is that the primary tool for doing excavation is the hand pick and the hand trowel, like a garden shovel, if you will. Tells, for example, where I work, our tell is 20 acres. A stratum might be a foot, 2 feet thick. How long would it take you to excavate 20 acres with a garden trowel a foot thick? It would take a very, very long time, and because of that, it simply takes too long, it's too expensive to do it that way. It costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to have an archaeological excavation open for a year, and so it's simply not practical to do the peel the onion method unless you've got a very small tell. Another method you might use is what Heinrich Schliemann used at Troy. That is the trenching method. The trenching method has a nice advantage because you can sort of chop all the way down to bedrock, and you can cut your way right across the middle of the tell, and that way you can look at the stratification on the walls and you can see what everything looks like in one big picture. Except, of course, you're not seeing what everything looks like. You're only seeing the things on the edges of the trench. Archaeology, by its nature, is a destructive discipline. We remove stuff, and then it's gone. So the keeping of records is very, very important to us. And somehow we want to both remove stuff and preserve stuff at the same time. So how do we reach that sort of compromise where we destroy enough to discover, but preserve enough to remember? The result is a compromise method that most archaeologists use now, which is to survey the top of the tell and divide the thing up into a grid system, usually 5 by 5 meter squares. And what we do typically is excavate one square, 5 by 5 meters, and only go down one stratum. See what you find, and then follow the clues. Maybe if you don't find anything, you go to the next stratum. Maybe if you start to find the beginning of a wall, then you want to do the square next to it to see if the wall continues, and you follow the clues. The slide here shows us the early stages of the excavation at Tel Es Safi, which archaeologists now think was the ancient Philistine town of Gath. And you can see the square system, and you can see the beginnings of how the excavation is opening up, the early walls that they found, etc. One thing you'll also notice is we tend to leave about 1 to 1.5 meters around the edge of a square. We call that a bulk wall, and that to the extent we leave that behind, we can go back and double check things later on, or later archaeologists can go double check things. But sometimes we need to take down the bulk walls in order to expose architectural features that are underneath. Now, of course, in order to undertake this discipline, we need people. We need lots and lots of people to engage in archaeology. What do those people look like? Well, they look like you and me. They look like just about anybody. We have volunteers from all over the world come into our excavation, usually about 50 at a time. We train them. It takes a few hours to train them. We supervise them. We help them out, and they do the labor, and they enjoy it very much because, of course, they're not just digging in the dirt like every child wants to do, but they're also discovering history in the process. So here's an archaeologist, a friend of mine who is retired. Here's another couple of archaeologists, a mother and daughter. The daughter was 12 years old, had a wonderful time. You'll notice that the mother was very proud of the fact that she got to use the big pick. Here are a couple of other archaeologists. Notice the dirt. You must get very dirty when you excavate. That's part of the fun. And here's a very clean archaeologist. We decided that he needed to quit early so he could get cleaned up and take this picture. He's very proud of himself because he's holding a coin. He found an ancient coin that day, and that is one of the very exciting things that happens sometimes when you're excavating. You find the unexpected. When you think of it, when you're excavating, you're always digging into the trash people left behind. People tend to reuse the stuff that's valuable. People do not tend to drop coins and want to leave them. They want to find them. They want to pick them up. So for that reason, we don't find them all that often, and when we find them, we celebrate. So my friend John here is celebrating with his coin. Okay, now to analysis. When you are excavating, how do you analyze what you find? And two things we do primarily. We pay attention to the stratification, and we pay attention to typology. Typology. Now, what do I mean by typology? If you watch movies, for example, it's not unusual that you can tell when a movie was made. You might be able to tell, for example, by the kinds of clothes people wear. You might be able to tell, for example, by the kinds of cars people drive. You might even be able to tell by some of the tints that are used in the colors of the movie. These are all elements of typology. We do it all the time. We see certain things that are familiar in certain patterns. We know that car models followed certain patterns in certain years, and we know when we see a certain kind of car and the general date of the cars, and that gives us an idea of when this film was made. Anything then that lasts a long time, that we do discover regularly in the ground, that slowly changes over time and can be studied at multiple sites so that you've got a large database for comparative purposes, we can do typology. Well, what is the great thing we do typology on? In Israel, it is going to be architectural forms, right? Shapes of houses and buildings, and pottery. We find pottery all over the place, and so we can do pottery typology. Now, in a place like Hawaii, for example, where they did not have pottery, but they did have fish hooks. They made fish hooks out of shells and bones, and again, they developed slowly over time, and so you can do a fish hook typology in Hawaii, while you can do a pottery typology around the Mediterranean, for example. So pottery is the big thing that we use most often to do typology, and here is an example. This is from the Iron Age, and it's a rather funny example because what you see in the top version here, a cooking pot is shaped like this, and it has a little rim sticking out around the edge so that you could pick up the pot. What's funny, of course, is this is a cooking pot. They get hot. And for centuries, indeed millennia, people had been cooking with these pots and burning their fingers when they took the pot off the fire because they have to hold on that little rim. For centuries this was taking place until somebody right around the time of King David, we call this Iron Age 2A, right around 1000, somebody figured out the handle. And so they put a little handle on the cooking pot. And now all of a sudden, of course, when one person puts a handle on a cooking pot, everybody else looks at it and says, I can't believe we hadn't thought of that before. And everybody puts handles on their cooking pot. We have a new type, right? And so now we know that cooking pots that are before 1000 BC do not have handles. Cooking pots that are after 1000 BC do have handles. So that's a pretty nice watershed that helps us date things by the pottery that we have. That's just one example. And of course, once you have the handles, then that notch, that ledge around the rim that we used to lift up the pot with, don't need that anymore. So that starts to go away. It's replaced by the handle, and you get slightly different shapes that way. This is typical of pottery throughout the Mediterranean. Now what I'd like to do is give you a few examples of what we actually see with the pottery pieces that we discover.